This is the collision of a German art film and a festering wound. Welcome to the depths. Hello, welcome or welcome back to Reading to the Depths. My name is Lecton. Thanks for spending some time with me. Today I have a review for you of Black Flame. This is the new book by Gretchen Felker-Martin. It's actually a horror novella, 200 pages, so it's either a long novella or a short novel. And it came out in August in America, but I think it's not coming out until November 2025 in UK and abroad. I really enjoyed this. I thought it was great. Now, before I get into my review or my discussion, I'm going to do something I don't usually do, which is I want to discuss the cover a little bit because I don't think the cover does justice to the story. So, at least not the American cover. If you look at the American cover, this feels almost like a YA cover. It looks a little bit cartoonish to me. I don't really like the font of the title. It looks amateurish. And the image, the central image, I think is nice. It looks fine. But from a distance, you can't really tell what's going on. Like, is that a snake in her mouth? Is that a bug? Like, there's film strip, right? That's film that's going around her throat and either coming in or going out of her mouth. But it's just not clear. And it doesn't do justice to the story. I think the story is, a lot more interesting than this cover lets on. If you compare that to the UK cover, or the cover being published by Titan Books, which is, I believe, the imprint that does UK and international distribution, this cover is much more graphic, and the main image is a photo negative of a person screaming, and that is like thematically resonant with the story. And instead of a face, you still have a film strip, then that film itself dissolves into this black flame, and the title font is just much more graphic, and I think this cover conveys the story in a much better way. And look, this is neither here nor there, but it sometimes matters. We say don't judge a book by its cover, but we all do, right? If you are in a mood and there's a certain vibe you're going for with your reading, and you have a long TBR and a bunch of books to choose, sometimes the cover is what leads you to one book or another. And I think that the American cover, even though I love Tor as an imprint and I think they publish really great work, I just think this cover doesn't really sell the book or the feeling of the book as much as the UK cover does. So aside from that, I also don't like to compare a book to the previous book by that author, but I think it's useful here. Just recently I read both of Gretchen Felker-Martin's other two novels, Cuckoo and Manhunt, and I read them in that order, which is not in publication order. Her first novel, Manhunt, and then her second novel was Cuckoo. And I enjoyed both of those quite a lot. I had some problems with them a little bit though. Manhunt, I felt that each individual character was interesting, but they all kind of felt the same. They all were focused on this deep self-loathing for whatever reason, and it didn't have a lot of narrative depth to it. It just was there. Like, this character was fat, therefore they had internalized fat phobia. This character is trans, therefore they had internalized transphobia. And there wasn't a lot of reasoning behind it. Or maybe there was. I'm sure there was, but just not on the page, right? And that novel also didn't really have a plot, not in a real meaningful plot. It was kind of just survive. Still, I enjoyed it quite a lot, but those were kind of my bugaboos with it. Then Cuckoo, I thought, had stepped up the game quite a bit. I thought the characters were much more well developed. There was a much larger cast of characters that we were following, different perspectives, and I thought they were more interesting, they were more diverse, and I really enjoyed spending time with them. And that one, my bigger problem was with the plot itself. Was interesting, but from the protagonist's point of view, I thought the plot was interesting, but the antagonist's motivation and the way they went about doing things didn't make sense to me. It felt very narratively convenient for her to tell the story she wanted to tell, but it didn't make sense in the world. I still had a good time with it, but it felt like, why is this happening? So I enjoyed both of those novels. There are parts of them that I really, really liked, and I liked the spirit of them. I liked the feeling. I liked the kind of rage that was behind them all, and the atmosphere that she created. There are just little parts that held me back from really loving them. And I think, though, if you look at her novels and her writing, I guess this is a novella, so not really a novel, but she has shown that her writing is getting smarter and more refined, and she's focusing on what she wants to do in a much more clear way. Black Flame feels like it is built off the backs of those two other novels. So I really appreciate this evolution of her writing and of her focus and of her character work and of her atmosphere. Everything, I think, is really on point in this novel. What is this novel about? It is classified or marketed as historical fiction because it takes place in 1985, which is kind of funny to me. I guess that's historical fiction. I don't know, but it's very 1985. That time and place is very important. It takes place in Staten Island, 1985, and that is part of the environment. And she does a good job of building up the environment there. But our main character is this woman who is 33, and she's a deeply closeted lesbian. And you find out that she wasn't so closeted in college, and then she had a bad experience, and her family, who is very wealthy, basically said, you have to stop this now. We're going to cure you. We're going to fix you, or you're not part of the family anymore. So she gets cured of her lesbianism. And instead, she's just miserable all the time and doesn't like herself and is unhappy. And again, Felker-Martin is going back to this idea of a character, as she did in her other, in especially Manhunt, of characters who have this self-loathing. But it makes sense in this world, right? It makes sense because of the character's family and environment and how the character develops. She is unhappy. She works for a company that takes old film that has been degraded in some ways, and they painfully restore it by hand, which is like a really interesting and symbolic jump in and of itself, because the character, what she likes to do and what she's good at is taking something and restoring it to its prior glory. No matter what has happened to it, all of the injustices the world has like reaped upon this film strip, she's able to go painstakingly, frame by frame, and restore it. And so that is thematically resonant with the story. So I think it's a very smart job. Never mind that it works into the plot. So her company acquires this film that is like from the 1930s from Germany. And it's this queer art film, like occult film, that disappeared during the Holocaust. There's like rumors of it, and art critics know about it, but no one's really seen the original work print of it. And basically, there was someone who died, and they find out that he was a Nazi who'd been living under an assumed name. And when he died, they found it in his possessions. So that is how they've come about having it, and it's her job to restore it. And the film is disturbing. The film is like, it bothers her, and yet the more she engages with it, it starts to invade her life, and the characters from the film and the sexuality and the violence of the film start pervading her real life, and her life and the film become like intertwined, and she loses touch with reality, and then the story goes from there. And so it does follow in the veins of other cursed film stories, and it really feels like a wonderful combination of experimental film by Gemma and Silver Nitrate by Silvia Moreno-Garcia. You can tell it's paying homage to both of those and to other books in the genre of like cursed film, but it feels like it's taking those two and combining them into something new. Like it stands on its own. It's not repetitive of those two, but it has the vibe of those two combined, I think. And I think it does it really well. Her writing in this is smart. It is descriptive. It is, the writing is very sensual. And I don't mean that like it's sexy. I mean that it makes you feel things, right? It makes you feel what the characters are feeling. It makes you feel like the dread and the disgust and like the sweat building on your skin, right? It makes you feel all these things. So that way is very sensual. I think the writing is great. It really works with the story. And it creates a strong atmosphere and a mood that's part and parcel with the world building. It takes place, like I said, in 1985 in New York, and it feels very claustrophobic, and you have this like paranoia always looking over your shoulder, like nothing feels settled. And like the casual racism and misogyny and anti-Semitism of the 1980s are all on display, and this character is at the center of all of it. And that makes the world feel gray and bleak. And so when you have this burst of this dark occult film that is showing like the forbidden, and it's in her face, and it's all the things that she's wanted but she's afraid of, and the parts of her that she's repressed and she's denied, they come like to life in front of her. It makes the world feel scary. It makes the world feel jagged and dangerous, and it works so well in here. So her world building, the atmosphere she creates, the inherent tension in the story is just so well developed, and it works really well. The story is very intense, both in terms of what's happening and the pacing and the characters. So the pacing is quite rapid. Like things happen right away. Right when she gets this film, when she's loading the film into her, whatever the machine she uses to analyze it, she cuts herself on the film, and her blood gets absorbed into the film. And look, I'm not giving anything away by saying that. That's like the setup of the story. That's never a good scene, right? When you cut yourself on a film and then that blood disappears, you just need to like rethink your situation a little bit, I think. So the story starts off and it just gets moving right away, and you devolve into this like nightmare dreamscape really quickly. And whether it's the nightmare dreamscape of the world that's within the film, or in her mind, or her regrets, or her past, like everything is unstable and you can't really grab hold on anything, except when she has like flashbacks of the time when she was in college, when she wasn't so miserable. Those feel like a breath of fresh air, except that they end. So they're like this tease that show that life doesn't have to be miserable, and her life wasn't always miserable, but her family and the expectations of her family and the expectations of society in general have made her life miserable. They encroach on her ability to live her true life, and her always being afraid of what others think, her always mediating her action and her emotional state, trying to please others. That has made her life small and unhappy and really depressive in many ways. You feel that right away, and the story runs with that. And so as soon as they acquire this film, things fall, like I said, into this nightmare, fever, dream landscape, and it just moves really quickly. The pacing is smart. It is short, like I said, it's only 200 pages, but every page is meaningful. You just feel like you're always rushing forward, and you can't tell what's in front of you. You don't know where you're going. It's probably not somewhere safe. It's not somewhere happy, but you're being propelled or pushed forward in a way that you can't really stop. And so I appreciated that. And I think that the pacing and the writing and the world building all work together to push you towards this end, which is ambiguous and disgusting and disturbing and kind of hard to even imagine. This narrative follows one perspective, which I think Gretchen Felker-Martin does really well. It makes the story much more like narratively confined in a way. In her other stories, she followed multiple characters' perspectives, and you moved back and forth, and that created a much more frenetic pace, which kept the audience a little bit at a distance from the novel. Right here, you're only following this main character, and because of that, you have this much more intimate experience that you grow with this character. You feel her fear and her pain, and even her triumph, the small moments of triumph that she has, and the story itself is just much more impactful because it's so confined to this one character. You also realize that her experience is unreliable. Once the world of the film starts invading her waking life, then you can tell that she has become unreliable. And so you are stuck with this unreliable experience. I think it was smart to stay with just one character perspective. It makes the writing stronger. It makes you feel it in a much more immediate kind of way. And you're really able to get lost in that character because you spend all this time with her. They are this profoundly sympathetic main character who has had happiness, who has tasted happiness, and who is scared of it. And instead, she tried to retreat to the comfort of her family, but her family never provided comfort. They only provided distrust. They provided judgment. They provided vitriol only. Yet, even in that, it was what she knew, right? It's what she grew up with. It's what she experienced from the world at large. So there even was some comfort in that emotional violence. You live that with this character. The character is really complicated, and I love it for her. The ideas that are being played with in the story, where this character sits among them, is this exploration of both queer and Jewish identities, and this character sitting right at the intersection of those two, and how those identities both serve as a locus for violence, both physical violence and emotional violence, and especially when they intersect and then they collide with classism and racism, misogyny, patriarchy, homophobia, all these things. The story itself is explicitly discussing the Holocaust, what was lost in the Holocaust, what existed before and what was taken away, not just in terms of the loss of life and culture, but the loss of identity. That plays an immediate part in the story, not just because this film was lost due to the Holocaust, but also her own personal journey has been disrupted by the violence of the Holocaust, the violence of anti-Semitism, and by the violence of fascism, and how fascism makes everything small. It refuses you the ability to see who you are. It denies you autonomy in any meaningful way. And so that is her experience, both as a Jewish and queer person in the scope of history, but also in her personal life with her family smothering her and with society smothering her and the people she works with and the guy that her family has set her up with because they think that she's too old not to be married and have kids and so forth. It is constant encroaching on her sense of autonomy, so she doesn't have any. So these are all ideas that are explored. It's not a story about finding yourself as much as it is a story about reclaiming yourself, understanding who you were and what you gave up and how to find that part of you that was always there, that you knew, reclaiming not just yourself, but your history, reclaiming your desire, reclaiming your right to occupy space. Right. And that is why I think that her job as someone who restores old films is so symbolic, that she takes these things, she sees what history has done to them, all the damage that has been wrought upon them, and she fixes them meticulously. She goes through it, she identifies flaws, and then she uses whatever tools she needs to repair it. And so that is what she's trying to do with her own life, but it's so much easier to do with film than it is to do with your life. Now, I should say that, like both Manhunt and Cuckoo, there is this undercurrent of rage and a sense of injustice throughout this whole novel. Now, in both Manhunt and in Cuckoo, that rage was at the forefront, right? It was overwhelming, and it was firing in all directions, especially in Manhunt. Here, it is simmering under the surface all the time. You can always feel that building tension, that anger, that frustration, that sense of injustice, but it is not spilling out onto the page, except in these occasional moments of these interruptions of violence. Now, the story is graphic, right? It is gory. It is both graphic in terms of sexual imagery and in violent imagery. Like I said, there's festering wounds. She cuts herself, and that is something you return to again and again. This cut on her hand that refuses to heal, that is like gross and disgusting. So there's this weird, gross body stuff, but it's not as overwhelming and as in her previous two novels. So these moments of like real graphic imagery and goriness come in and out, right? And in many ways, it feels almost more effective because it isn't as overwhelming. There are moments of calm and there's moments of real emotional dis-ease and disturbance. And then those are punctuated by this like really gross, disgusting imagery, or this really over-the-top, kinky, sexual, erotic imagery, which is both violent and erotic at the same time. And so I think the balance of like really building this unease, this tension, and this like paranoia slash, bleak gray world that's claustrophobic. And then that is cut through with these moments, these explosions of violence or of gore or of sexuality. That shows how a lack of regulation of your emotional landscape just disrupts everything in your life. So I think the narrative and the narrative flow, as well as just the writing style, is really well shaped here. I think these moments of gore and violence and sexuality, they're unflinching. As usual, Gretchen Felker-Martin doesn't pull any of her punches, but she wants you to feel every single blow that she is giving you, as opposed to just overwhelming you with this imagery on every page. She holds back, and then she only lets go with it when she really wants you to know that this is something you should be feeling right now. As I said, this is a sensual book. It isn't a sexy book. It's a book that you feel. It's a book that you experience with all of your senses. And I think that the use of gore and violence and sexuality, it works to that effect. It's much more restrained, not in the sense that it isn't over the top, but that it's limited and it doesn't happen on every page. It happens in doses that make it more impactful. I really like the way the story ends as well. It isn't black and white, right? There's room for ambiguity, and you can experience it as either like violent triumph or great loss or somewhere in between. Like the ending makes sense in this world, but it isn't, it doesn't have like clear-cut lines. And I like that. It goes with the whole vibe of the story of being like a nightmare, being like a fever dream, being unsettled, being something you can't really hold in your hands, or if you try to, it's just going to slip away. Being something that's you see out the corner of your eyeball when you turn and look, it isn't there anymore. The ending works with that. And I think she's earned the ending. Like the character and the writing and the narrative, it earns the ending that it gives. And it felt impactful and it worked for the story very much. So clearly I really enjoyed this story. I think that this novel shows an evolution in Gretchen Felker-Martin's writing. And who am I, right, to judge someone's writing? But having read her other two published works, I think this one really shows that she is improving her craft with every story. And I really had a great time with it. It was disturbing. It made me uneasy. It made me think about a whole lot of things, about violence, about oppression, about finding yourself, about realizing the violence we do to ourselves when we deny who we really are, and then how that violence is both forced on us from the outside, but something we cultivate within ourselves, and what does that deprive us of, and what is the consequence of that? Maybe if all of us were just so lucky to have some German expressionistic art house films invade our lives, then we could find out who we truly are. But I think I'll leave it there. I really enjoyed this novella. I hope you do too. I'd love to hear your thoughts if you've read it, or if you've read either Manhunt or Cuckoo. I will leave links to my discussion of those books and to my reviews of it down in the comments below. But I'd love to hear your thoughts on either of those, or this if you've read it, or on anything else that you want to talk about. For now, I'll say thank you for spending this time with me today. I appreciate you. Please be kind to yourselves, take care of each other, and go slowly.